Some memories slip quietly into the background of a person's life, softening at the edges until they feel more like dreams than something lived. But others stay sharp, so sharp that even 50 years later they return with startling clarity. For Daniel Carter, a young American soldier who first stepped into Vietnam in the late spring of 1969, the memory that never faded wasn't of an ambush, or the night his convoy was hit, or the days spent marching through dense jungle with the smell of smoke lingering on everything. His clearest memory was of a girl standing behind a small wooden counter in a tiny shop off a narrow village road, her voice quiet, her smile gentle, her presence unexpectedly calm amid a world on fire. Daniel had been 21, exhausted and carrying more weight in his heart than in his pack when he first walked into that shop. The village was small, hardly more than a cluster of weathered buildings with roofs made of tin and palm leaves, but it had a certain warmth to it. Children chased each other along the dusty road, chickens wandered between doorways, vendors sold fruit beneath patched umbrellas, and near the edge of the village stood the shop. Paint peeling, windows fogged with humidity, wooden shelves lined with small, everyday essentials. She was always there. Her name was Lynn. She was the shopkeeper's daughter, barely 18, her hair tied back neatly, her eyes soft but alert, always watching the road with a mixture of curiosity and caution. At first, she and Daniel exchanged nothing more than short greetings, polite nods, the simple transactions of a soldier buying a bottle of water or a packet of crackers. But something in her presence steadied him, like a moment of stillness carved out from the noise and chaos gripping the rest of the country. Daniel found reasons, perhaps excuses, to stop by whenever his patrol passed through. He told himself he needed more cigarettes or another canteen top or simply a few minutes of shade. But deep down, the truth was gentler and simpler. Talking to Lynn felt like remembering a part of himself that the war had tried to bury. She asked him small questions in careful English. He answered in slow, halting phrases, trying not to overwhelm her with words or presence. Their conversations stretched longer each time. She learned that he was from Indiana, that he missed his mother's cooking, that he hated the monsoon rains. He learned that she was the oldest of 3 children, that her father's shop had been built before the war, and that she liked to draw birds in the margins of old notebooks she kept hidden under the counter. He watched her sketch once, light strokes, graceful curves, and he realized she had a softness the world was trying so hard to take away from her. He admired her strength in ways he couldn't put into words then. She lived in a place where the war pressed against every door and window, yet she still offered kindness to strangers, including the American soldier who appeared in her shop week after week. Daniel never told her this, but during those months, she was the one part of Vietnam that didn't feel like it was slipping through his fingers. Something about the innocence of their exchanges felt like a reminder that not everything was destruction. Not everything had turned to fear. Sometimes, a moment of connection, small, fragile, almost accidental, could survive even in a war zone. But war does not wait for gentle things. It interrupts, it redirects, it tears people away from what anchors them. As Daniel's deployment stretched forward, the fighting around Lynn's village intensified. Patrols became more dangerous. Travel became unpredictable. Still, he walked toward the shop whenever he could, even if only for a minute of quiet and the sound of her voice. He didn't know then that his time there was running out. He didn't know that the next time he left her shop, it would be the last time for nearly half a century. And he didn't know the weight that memory of her, of that small shop, of a friendship born in impossible circumstances, would carry through the rest of his life. Daniel and the men in his unit learned quickly that the war in 1969 was unpredictable. One day, they marched through villages where families offered small bowls of food despite having little themselves. The next, they were taking cover from sudden bursts of gunfire, unsure whether the shots came from hidden fighters or someone trying to scare them away. The world shifted from calm to danger in an instant, and a soldier's heart learned to live somewhere between readiness and exhaustion. Yet each time Daniel's patrol route brought him near the village, he felt the shift long before he reached it. The air carried a quieter rhythm, The soldiers loosened their shoulders. Even the ground felt different beneath his boots. And always his eyes drifted toward the shop long before it came into view. Over time, it became clear that Lynn felt the same cautious sense of familiarity. The first time she spoke more than a few words to him, her voice trembled, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. American soldiers were not the kind of people she had ever expected to know. But she watched him every time he approached, how he treated children who ran up to him, how he respected her father, how he stepped aside when elderly villagers passed, bowing slightly in a quiet gesture of respect that he had learned from observing them. Trust in a place torn by war was fragile. Yet somehow, without either of them meaning to, trust began to grow. Daniel never lingered long, 10 minutes, 15 at most. But those minutes were enough to build a rhythm. He would take off his helmet, wiping dust from his brow. Lynn would hand him water before he even asked. Her small act of anticipation, something he cherished more than he ever admitted. She asked questions in pieces. You have family? What is your home like? Winter? Is it very cold? He answered with stories, simple ones he hoped would make her smile. He told her about snowball fights with his brothers, about his mother's peach pies, about the fields near his childhood home that turned gold every autumn. In return, she told him things she rarely shared with anyone, that she dreamed of becoming a teacher someday, that she wanted the war to end, not for her own freedom, but for her younger siblings' chance at a future, that she collected scraps of paper just to have something to draw on. But what truly bound them together were the moments between their words. The way she laughed softly when he tried to speak Vietnamese and mispronounced every syllable. The way he gently teased her about hiding her drawings from him. The way she stood a little closer each time he visited the shop, her nervousness slowly replaced by something warmer. Daniel never let himself call it love. Love felt too big, too dangerous, too unrealistic for the world they lived in. But he understood, deep in his chest, that their connection mattered more than anything else he found in Vietnam. The other soldiers noticed. They joked lightly at first, nudging him with knowing smiles. But as the war worsened and tensions thickened, the joking faded, replaced by something more solemn, a silent acknowledgement that these moments with Lynn were holding Daniel together. For Lynn, each visit from the American soldier brought a mixture of comfort and fear. Comfort because he was gentle, unlike many soldiers who passed through. Fear because every time he left, she wondered whether she would ever see him again. She learned to listen for his footsteps on the dirt road, not the heavy march of a whole patrol, but the familiar cadence of his stride. Sometimes she felt disappointment wash over her when the soldiers who entered the shop were strangers. And sometimes she felt relief, because strangers meant he was still alive somewhere. Then one afternoon, as monsoon clouds thickened overhead, Daniel walked into the shop carrying a small wooden bird carved from leftover ration box scraps. Rough but carefully made. He placed it gently on the counter. For you, he said, because you like birds. Lynn stared at it, touched in a way she had no words for. She held it carefully, like something fragile. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't a promise. But it was enough for both of them, enough to know this friendship was real, even in a place where everything else felt temporary. Neither of them realized how soon war would tear that fragile bond apart. Rain hammered the village for days. The monsoon had arrived with a vengeance, drowning pathways in mud and pushing soldiers and villagers alike into cramped shelters. Daniel hadn't seen Lynn in nearly a week. Every day he hoped for a brief visit, just a few minutes under the shop's awning, where her presence made even the storm seem less oppressive. But that week, the war was tightening its grip around the area. Rumors spread quickly through the unit. Enemy fighters were moving closer, setting traps along trails the Americans had once used without fear. Patrols doubled. Nights became restless, filled with reports crackling through radios. And then the order came. Daniel's unit was to relocate immediately. No warning, no transition, no final passes through the village. They were moving out the next morning. Daniel felt the news like a blow to the ribs. He tried to reason with himself. This was war. Plans shifted, nothing was ever guaranteed. But the thought of leaving without a word, without even one last look, tightened his chest until breathing felt painful. That night, while the rain battered their temporary camp, he sat under a small tarp and carved another wooden bird. This one was smaller, simpler, made from a piece of ration crate he had saved without thinking. The entire time, he imagined placing it in Lynn's hands, imagined the way she would smile softly, as if grateful even for the smallest gestures. Before sunrise, he approached the sergeant. "With your permission, sir, I need 10 minutes in the village." The sergeant shook his head immediately. "It's too hot right now. Intel says movement tonight. No exceptions. We leave at dawn." Daniel pushed again, a rare act of defiance. "It'll take me 5 minutes. I need to say goodbye." "Goodbyes," the sergeant said firmly. "Get people killed." That was the end of it. When the convoy rolled out at first light, the village lay just beyond the trees. Daniel stared at it until it disappeared behind the foliage. His hand remained tight around the small, carved bird the entire ride. Lynn, meanwhile, had risen early as she always did. She swept the shop floor, arranged bottles on the shelf, watched the road with the quiet hope she never voiced aloud. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the air thick and heavy. She waited longer than usual, glancing up at every passing sound. But he never came. By midday she sensed that something had shifted, though she couldn't explain how. The shop felt emptier. The road felt quieter. The world felt as if someone had taken a deep breath and held it. She asked a passing villager if they had seen the group of American soldiers, the ones who came through regularly. "They moved out early," the man said, "before sunrise." Her heart sank. She didn't understand why the disappointment felt so sharp. She went inside and sat behind the counter, her hands resting on the wooden surface she had polished hundreds of times. She told herself it was better this way. Attachments were dangerous in wartime. People vanished. Life changed without warning. But even with all her efforts, tears welled in her eyes. She whispered softly into the still air, "I hope you are safe." Daniel never returned to the village. His rotation shifted, his movements redirected, and within months he was preparing to go home. He carried the small carved bird with him everywhere, tucked in the breast pocket of his uniform. He didn't know why he kept it. He only knew that throwing it away would feel like betraying something he didn't fully understand. When his plane lifted off Vietnamese soil for the last time, he looked out the window at the country beneath him. He wondered whether Lynn had ever come back to the shop that day expecting to see him. He wondered whether she thought he had simply forgotten. He wondered if she had survived. War left them both with questions that haunted them in different corners of the world. And neither imagined that nearly 50 years later those unanswered questions would lead them back to the same small shop they once shared. Daniel returned to the United States carrying the invisible weight that many veterans brought home: quiet memories, half-healed wounds, and unanswered what-ifs that lingered in the back of the mind long after the uniform was folded away. He adjusted to civilian life as best he could, earned a degree on the GI Bill, worked as a mechanic for years, and eventually opened his own small repair shop in Indiana. He married, he raised 2 children, he built a stable life brick by brick, day by day. But every now and then, without meaning to, he would find himself drifting back to the narrow road lined with weathered houses, to the sound of chickens scratching in the dust, to the soft voice behind the wooden counter of the shop. He wondered how Lynn had fared after the war ended, whether her family had survived, whether the shop had remained standing after so much destruction swept across the country, whether she had kept drawing those delicate sketches of birds. He rarely spoke about her, not because the memory was painful, but because it was precious. Too delicate to hand over to a world that might not understand why a brief friendship from so long ago meant so much. The small wooden bird he had carved on the night before he left Vietnam sat in a drawer in his workshop. He hadn't intended to keep it forever, but every time he tried to put it away or throw it out, he hesitated. Something in him resisted letting go. Life moved forward. His children grew up, got married, started families of their own. His hair grayed. His hands became rough from decades of fixing engines. The war felt like another lifetime, a distant chapter he sometimes questioned whether he had actually lived. But every year, around the start of summer, when the air grew humid and thunderstorms rolled through Indiana, he found himself thinking about Lynn again. Did she think he abandoned her without a word? Did she ever look at the road expecting to see him? Did their brief connection mean anything to her after the war scattered everything? He would never know. At least that's what he believed for nearly 5 decades. Then in 2017, Daniel made a spontaneous decision that surprised even him. He sat at his kitchen table one quiet morning, sipping coffee and reading a travel brochure about guided tours in Southeast Asia, something his daughter had mailed to him without much thought. He flipped through the pages absent-mindedly until a photograph appeared that made his breath catch. A lantern-lit street in central Vietnam, crowded, colorful, unmistakable. It was a village he recognized. He hadn't expected the rush of emotion that followed, the sudden tightness in his throat, the pounding in his chest, the immediate knowledge that he needed to go back. Not for closure, not for answers, not even for nostalgia. Just to see it again. Just to stand in the place where he had once found a sliver of peace in the middle of war. He booked a flight that same week. He didn't tell his children the full reason for the trip. He simply said he wanted to visit Vietnam one last time, to see how the country had changed, to honor the memories of the people he once met. As the departure date approached, he found himself opening the drawer where the wooden bird still rested. He held it gently in his palm, as if afraid it might break after all those years. He tucked it into his bag without fully understanding why. Maybe he didn't need a reason. Some memories deserve the chance to come full circle. The village had changed, yet not changed at all. When Daniel stepped off the small tour bus and onto the dusty road, the first sensation that hit him was familiarity. The sounds, the humidity, the smell of street food drifting from nearby stalls. It all felt like opening a book he had once loved and thought he had lost. But modern life had woven itself into every corner. Electric cables lined rooftops. New shops stood beside older ones. More tourists wandered the streets. The world had moved forward, and yet the place still carried the heartbeat of the village he once knew. He walked slowly, letting his feet guide him more by instinct than by memory. He recognized the bend in the road where his unit used to take breaks, the cluster of houses where children once ran barefoot, and the narrow alley where vendors had sold fruit to passing soldiers. Then he saw it, the shop, older, weathered, repainted more than once, but unmistakable. The small wooden sign, the slanted roof, the doorway worn smooth by decades of hands. His heart hammered in his chest. He stepped toward it without breathing. Inside, the shop was quiet. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everyday items, tea, batteries, small household goods. Everything arranged neatly, just as it had been nearly 50 years ago. And behind the counter stood a woman, her hair streaked with gray, her posture graceful despite age, her face marked with lines of time. But her eyes were the same. He stood frozen in the doorway. She looked up politely, expecting a customer, and then she paused. Her brow furrowed, her eyes widened. She stared at him, not with confusion, but with the slow dawning recognition of someone seeing a ghost from her past. She whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "Daniel?" The sound of his name in her voice, the same soft tone, the same careful pronunciation, hit him so hard he had to steady himself on the door frame. "Yes," he said, barely able to speak. "Lynn, it's me." For a moment, neither moved. Time folded itself around them, collapsing decades into a single breath. It felt impossible, unreal, like something out of a story people tell but never believe. Then she stepped forward, covering her mouth with her hand as tears filled her eyes. "I thought you died," she said. "When you didn't come back, I thought—" She broke off, her voice trembling. Daniel shook his head. "We were moved without warning. I never had the chance to say goodbye." She reached out slowly, unsure if she was allowed to touch him, as if afraid he might disappear. He took her hand gently. Her fingers were smaller than he remembered, but the warmth of her touch felt exactly the same. In the corner of the shop, her younger sister, now a grown woman, stared in shock. A passing neighbor peeked inside after hearing the commotion. Word spread quickly, as stories often do in small villages. Within minutes, people began gathering near the entrance, whispering with wide-eyed amazement. An American soldier from the war, the shopkeeper's daughter he once befriended, reunited after almost half a century. Daniel and Lynn sat down behind the counter just as they had so many years before. She poured him tea with trembling hands. He told her about his life, his family, his work, his years after the war. She listened intently, her eyes occasionally drifting to his face to make sure he was real. Then she told him her story. How her family survived, how the shop stayed open, how she waited for months after he left, unsure whether he had lived. She admitted she had carried the memory of him quietly, tucked away in a place she rarely let her thoughts linger. Then Daniel reached into his bag. He pulled out the small wooden bird. Her breath caught. "You kept it," she whispered. "For 48 years, he said quietly. "I always hoped I could give it to you." She held it with both hands, just as she had held the first bird he carved so long ago. Tears fell silently onto the carved wooden wings. Outside, people watched through the open doorway, moved by a reunion no one had ever expected. A soldier and the shopkeeper's daughter, brought together again by memory, by fate, and by a moment of kindness that had survived nearly 5 decades. After the shock of their reunion settled into something softer and more real, Daniel and Lynn walked slowly through the village together. People smiled, nodding with recognition, whispering the story to one another as they passed. Even those who hadn't been born during the war seemed deeply moved, as if witnessing something sacred, proof that time does not erase every connection. They stopped at the edge of the river where Daniel once sat with his unit, cleaning his boots and listening to the distant rumble of helicopters. The water flowed gently, reflecting the bright sky above. The air smelled of jasmine and grilled meat from nearby vendors. Life, busy and ordinary, hummed around them. "It's all so different," Daniel said softly, looking out at the water. "And all the same," Lynn replied. She pointed to the bridge, explaining how it had been rebuilt 3 times. She showed him where her family's home used to be before it was moved uphill. She told him about her siblings, one living in the city, one working at a farm nearby. She had never married, she added quietly, the words almost lost in the breeze. Daniel didn't ask why. He didn't need to. Later, they returned to the shop where Lynn prepared a small meal for him, rice, vegetables, and a dish with flavors that carried the warmth of her family's traditions. As they ate, they slipped into the same gentle rhythm they once shared, talking openly, smiling easily, feeling as though the years between them had melted away. "You were the first American I ever trusted," she said suddenly, her voice soft, "the only one who treated me like a friend." Daniel felt the words settle deeply within him. "You were the only part of Vietnam that felt like home to me." Her eyes softened, and for a moment they simply sat in silence, the unspoken hovering between them like something fragile but strong. As the afternoon light shifted into gold, a small crowd gathered outside again. People asked for photos with Daniel, some out of curiosity, others out of gratitude for the soldier who had once walked their roads. He posed reluctantly, smiling shyly, the attention unfamiliar but strangely heartwarming. One elderly woman approached Lynn quietly and whispered, "You see, fate brings people back." Lynn smiled, though her eyes glistened. Eventually, Daniel knew he had to leave. His tour group was waiting. He stood slowly, unwilling to let the moment end. Lynn walked him to the doorway, just as she had done so many times nearly half a century earlier. He hesitated before stepping out. She hesitated too. Then she placed her hand on his arm. "Come back again," she said gently. "Not after 48 years. Come back soon." He nodded. "I will." They embraced, slowly, carefully, with years of unspoken emotion carried in the way they held each other. When they let go, Lynn touched the wooden bird she still held close to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, "for remembering me." He smiled, though tears blurred his vision. "Some people," he said softly, "you don't forget." As he walked down the road, he turned back once. She stood in the shop doorway watching him, just as she once had in 1969 when he left after every visit. Only this time, she was smiling. Not with sadness or uncertainty, but with peace. The villagers watched him go, whispering about the reunion they had just witnessed. Some called it destiny, some called it fate. But to Daniel and Lynn, it was something simpler, something profoundly human. Two lives that touched in the middle of a war, two hearts that never forgot, a moment that survived time itself. And while life had taken them in different directions for nearly 5 decades, the bond forged in that small village shop remained, quiet, gentle, and unbroken. A reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, kindness endures, and sometimes it finds its way back home.